Okay, consciously and unconsciously, we all make assessments about the world around us based on the reverb we hear. And this isn't just on records or in live sound, this is just in our everyday experience. And we analyse the reverberations. The research done by Sabine in the late Victorian period gives us a calculation of the absorption of a material at a certain frequency, and this gives us the numbers which will tell us how reverb from different materials will sound in theory. Okay. So yeah, in a space, listeners will first hear the source of the sound, because that will travel the shortest path to them, and then just after that will be the early reflections, and they give us the first indication of what a space sounds like. And if they arrive less than 30 milliseconds after the source, they'll also serve to amplify the signal, because that sound that would go in another direction is bouncing and coming to us, so we're getting more of it. And because it's less than 30 milliseconds, the brain assumes it's one sound source. Any more than that, and we'll distinguish them as two different sounds, and they'll become a bit disembodied. And after that we have the reverb tail, or the later reflections. And these give you an idea of, well, they give you more of an idea of what the material that the room is made of is, and it also gives you an idea about the amount of space, because obviously the longer the reverb, the more reflective or the bigger the space is. And here's a sort of illustration of a space. You have the source, and it goes straight to the listener, and then you have other surfaces making new waves, and these will come, so that's like an early reflection, and then the waves that bounce around a lot more will be the later reflections and make the tail. Might have pressed the button twice then. No. Okay, reverberation was only researched first by Sabine in the late 1800s, and subsequently to the present day there's been a lot of work on it, but they've been utilised by people for thousands of years. And because reverb can amplify a source, like I said earlier, you can take a relatively quiet musical performance and cast it to more people, because you can get more of the sound to arrive at the listener. And especially when composers have a knowledge of acoustics, even before acoustic sciences was developed, they can tailor a musical performance or a piece to suit the environment in which it's supposed to be in, and they can compose it for maximum audibility. And in fact, Marshall Long writes in his Architectural Acoustics that in Europe, prehistoric tribes sought shelter in caves, and later constructed increasingly large and reverberant temples and churches, and the Gregorian chant grew out of acoustical characteristics of Gothic churches, and subsequently Baroque music was written to accommodate the churches of the time. And we can see from my example that when you're dealing with a very long reverb time, such as you get in a church, that music would have to be designed to fit that, otherwise it just becomes really blurry and non-distinct. Let's play this. We can hear from that's like a very long reverb tail. I mean, I made these in Space Designer in Logic, because I didn't have access and the time to go out and actually capture live reverb. So that's a kind of approximation of, an idea of what we're talking about. And you can see that that's captured from a large sort of Gothic church, and the reverb time is about 7 seconds. Yeah, and Sabine also wrote quite a lot about what he thought acoustics meant for music in different cultures. And he said that European musicians, he theorised that European musicians developed the tonal scale and the melodic music earlier than tribal Africa, simply because in Africa warm climate meant more outdoor meetings, and in order to cast music performances to a larger audience, you'd need to use very loud instruments, and rhythm was the best way to achieve this. And in Europe, religious services were dominated by the vast cathedrals that were built to house them. And he said that even spoken service became intoned in a chant, and worship is in part determined by acoustical conditions. Sabine's RT60 equation that we've gone through describes how materials absorb sound. And we see here that I've got some values for brick and a very hard stone surface. And we have a very low absorption rate, particularly in the higher frequencies. So the reverb will be very bright, and will tell the listener instantly that they're listening to a bright sounding reverb. And we can see that softer furnishings, particularly in the higher frequencies, absorb a lot of the sound and will give a darker reverb, so you'll know straight away when you hear it that you'll be given the cue that the environment is very soft, or there's lots of soft things in it. This is Bill Putnam Sr., and my research has led me to believe that he invented the use of reverb as an effect and not simply as recording it in the environment with the instruments and the performers. He recorded a song with just 4 harmonicas in it, and he used the bathroom in the Chicago Civic Opera studio, and he put a loudspeaker and a microphone, and he played a copy of the signal that he'd recorded from the harmonicas, played it in the sound, captured it, and then he had a track with the original sound and the reverb on it. And this starts to give you a great deal of control over how you want the audience to perceive the space, because before you'd just be stuck with what you get from the environment, but now we actually see it as an effect that you can design. And it sort of opens up a dialogue really between the audience and the producer, because now instead of saying well, here's the environment that this ensemble is in, because with an orchestra you'd say it's going to be an amphitheatre. Now you can say, well, what environment is this ensemble in? You can change the environment, you can move a sound in space and move it somewhere else for a different feel, or you can make it sound darker or brighter. You can suggest different materials, and you can use panning to sort of place your listener where you want them to be in relation to the sound source. And you can adjust the length of reverb time to suggest different spaces, and the overall sound of the reverb can suggest a totally different feel to the piece than you would have had originally. So if you want to accentuate that the song is lonely, you can use a sort of more intimate reverb, a longer reverb, sorry, and if you want it to be more intimate, you can make it sound as if your performer is in the room with you, with your audience. And it's using those psychoacoustic cues that I talked about earlier that we can make that space. This sort of is my example of what his reverb would have sounded like, again using Logic Space Designer. There's a sort of bathroom impulse response in there, and I applied it, I can't remember what I applied, I think to some vocals again. Yeah, so what Bill Putnam sort of showed in this track is that you can take a small ensemble or a small source of audio, and you can give it a large and a rich and a textured sound, and that record achieved high sales, and it was cost effectively produced. So he really sort of set the mission statement out for what you could achieve without field recording and without large expensive spaces, just with the studio, what you could do acoustically. I've got an example of a panned reverb here, which sort of shows how you can, just using Bill Putnam's setup, how you can place the listener in the space. So we've got mainly sort of dry in this speaker and then a bit of reverb in that one, and especially with headphones it suggests the idea that rather than your the instruments being on a sound stage and you're looking at them, you've got things coming from your right and there's a big wall on your left, and you can really sort of hear the space. I've got some examples here how you can really simply, like with equalization, give a totally different sound to the same audio example. And so I've got two reverbs that are they're the identical reverbs. They're about they're only a fraction of a second long, quite bright sort of plate sounding reverbs. And on the first one I've taken out all the low frequencies and just accentuated the highs a bit, and it gives the impression of sort of a stone room, quite a small one, but quite hard materials. And here I've sort of boosted the lows and taken off the highs a bit to try and suggest wooden materials, like I showed in the Sabine values graph earlier, where the wood would the softer materials would absorb more high frequencies. So just using the same reverb and the knowledge of acoustics, you can design your own. I think that shows that quite nicely. And this is a picture here of two strange men in Abbey Road's echo chamber. And it's a purpose-built room. It uses exactly the same system as Bill Putnam. They copied his system, but they had the resources to install a dedicated space that was isolated. So, you can really stop those other sounds getting in. Which, if you're using a public space that's used for other things, there's gonna be conflicts in time. And they were able to design their room to their specifications, and that had quite a large impact in music, because it was used extensively on the album Please Please Me by the Beatles, although later they moved on to the sort of the newer technologies that were around at the time. The only disadvantage with using a reverb chamber in a studio is that if you want two reverb effects, you've got to build another whole room, and you've got to pay for another bit of real estate to sit there doing nothing apart from this one effect. So when newer technologies came along, these things became like a thing of the past almost overnight, but it sort of marks the end of using real acoustic space, dedicated space to create reverbs, because nowadays, like I'm using here, we're using just impulse responses and plugins. I'm just going to play an audio example of chamber sort of sounds like. I think the Space Designer has a couple of impulses of different types of chambers, and this one sounded quite good, so I used it. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.